It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Hello, Irwin.
You know, I have to say this. Over the course of, I don't even know what number episode we're on right now, but seems like 130.
Because we're just having fun.
We're just having fun. It seems like episode 131, but I don't think it is. But, you know, we've talked about this, how a lot of the subject matter we've spoken of is, it's stuff we've known about it, but it's a little bit off radar, whether we're talking about, Montauk Shores, whether we were talking about Leisure-Rama, Sands. They're around, there are stories not all that well known. Those are front page headlines next to this one. I mean, those were on the Shinnecock billboards, okay?
Yeah.
To this story, which I want to thank you, because you kept bringing this up to me over the past few months. And I would look into it and I'd say, wow, I mean, it sounds fascinating, but there's just not that much information on it. And why don't we break the suspense? What we're talking about is an enclave called Midhamptons.
That's right. And, well, you could say it's the enclave that I live in.
That I was actually just going to say, I was really going to ask that question. I was going to play Jeopardy. The answer is the enclave where Esperanza Leon lives in.
Yes, well, because I'm so exclusive,
Exactly right. But you actually could have answered that by saying, what is Midhamptons? Because this story is a killer for me. Now, we have to go back to the very early days. And part of what makes this story so cool for me is, and we'll get into this, there's a very big connection to where I spent a good part of I guess I can't call it my formative years, but I can call
your youth.
not my youth. That was spent in Queens. But my formative years as when I first got married, when we first, my wife and I first started having children and everything else, we lived for 36 years in Great Neck, Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to come into play, but I think we're going to start really at the very beginning, Esperanza. It's always good to start at the beginning, right? So there was a newspaper entitled The County Review, based in Riverhead. And there was a 1926 article. It was reported in other places too, but there was a 1926 article that, this is hard to believe, 1,000 acres of Midhampton, which is what this is going to be called. But these 1,000 acres were actually in Wainscott.
Right.
And I mean, this went really, it went both north and south of the highway.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, when you think about it at that point, Wainscott was 1926. Wainscott was, there was no highway per se. I mean, there was, but think about it. It was really concentrated south by the ponds, right? So by the ocean. So this was all
exactly
woodlots.
Completely. And these developers, Lyrico Estates, which I guess is their little abbreviation for what they really were, Long Island Realty Investors Corp. And as this County Review newspaper describes, $1 million corporation. And hey, in 1926, $1 million meant something.
No kidding.
This was a big business. I mean, $1 million corporation. Apparently, the Ives Company and George Grandy of Southampton assembled these Wainscott tracks, and they extended, to the point you were just mentioning, from the railroad, which is a whole other story, to Georgia Pond, including frontage on the Atlantic Ocean. And this was going to be extensively developed by the Midhamptons Corporation, along with, all right, this is something Esperanza and I touched on right before we got on. I like what Esperanza said, the more things change, because They were working with some of the most successful developers on the West End of Long Island.
Yeah. The more things change, the more things stay the same.
And, to give you some of these names, and this I actually think was from a New York Times article looking at this. This is a little photograph. We couldn't really make it out, but one of the most important announcements in the real estate world, Lyrico Estates, Frank Knighton of Great Neck, Long Island, we'll get into him later, and associated with these other well-known, and I quote, men, because in 1926, anyway.
Well, remember,
yeah,
women didn't exist.
They
couldn't have
exist.
A bank account.
They didn't have a bank. I weren't not sure if they were voting then. They were women artists, but they were an artist. We spoke on that in a prior episode. But we had Alric H. Mann, the president of the Kew Gardens Corporation, and Ray Palmer, a consulting engineer, Roger Black from Port Washington, the secretary of this organization, and I want his name mentioned because he is going to come into play in this episode, Ralph W. McPhee of Great Neck, New York as well. And there are a bunch of others that we need not get into. And furthering this a little bit along, E. Harry Howard of Montauk, he started last week the work of clearing some of these Lyrico estates to build, Esperanza, to build 40 miles of road.
Right. And to mention, Howard contributed to the Montauk development. I presume Carl Fisher. I'm thinking that was what he worked on as well.
That is correct. And these men that were working were being housed in the old Schwenk house, which now the Schwenks, well, I know one of the Schwenks was the big family right on 27, the big plot of land in Sagaponack.
Right.
I'm going to assume this housing was somewhere within this neck of the woods. But in addition to the roads, the work that Frank Knighton and his associates planned for Midhamptons, get a load of this, Esperanza. The building of a $50,000 in the 1920s. This was a $50,000 station for the Long Island Railroad. Now, Esperanza, we know there was a railroad station, obviously, in Bridgehampton and one in East Hampton. Now,
and there was a train depot, and it still is in Wainscott. It's more like Sagaponack, but it's
right.
there.
And that's sort of like on. Is that on Town Line Road where that depot used to be? Do we know exactly? We never.
What I know as a train depot is the one that is on Narrow Lane in Sagaponack.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Narrow Lane in Sagaponack. So just like on the border, really, of Wainscott, to the.
And unless maybe there was a whole other train station that I am not aware of, I think that was the one that was used by the farmers because it was primarily used as a depot to ship off all of the produce, potatoes and whatever else was grown and shipped out.
Okay. Got you. Thank you for that clarification. Now, so in addition to this, in addition to the train station, these were some of Midhampton's plans. Okay. And again, really, and this is a theme we do on Our Hamptons so often. Try to transport yourself back to a place, back to a time. So we're in 1920s Wainscott. Esperanza pointed out there was a highway. Yeah, that highway probably was barely paved. It was probably a whatever.
Right. No, and it's still parts of it. And I don't know if it was this one in particular, but I presume, if you ever stop on the rest area on the south side of the highway, current 27, that's Old Montauk Highway.
Okay. Perfect. No, that's
situating you a bit.
That's the kind of information. That's the kind of information we need here for this for Midhampton. So now the plans for these, not only what we just spoke of, the $50,000 train station, but the 40 to 50 miles of road. But now, all right, some of these are just a boat club on really essentially what's Georgica Pond, but Esperanza, before we started this episode, told me there was a period of time, and you see it even referred to sometimes. People call this Georgica Lake.
Yeah,
but
sometimes.
Essentially, it's a boat club on Georgica Pond. A bathing. All right, Esperanza, I hope you're sitting. You are sitting. I'm looking at Esperanza. She is sitting down, thankfully, because they were planning a bathing casino on the ocean here in Atlantic City, Midhamptons.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
my God, polo fields, an 18-hole golf course. I love this one. Aviation fields. Did they have a premonition, Esperanza?
I wonder if it wasn't actually that was the beginning of the airport.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, was this like, hey, these people dropped the seed, but they're calling it aviation fields, but
Yes.
you have to wonder. And playgrounds for children, several hundred new summer homes. And again, remember, 1926. Think of the transit coming out here. Think of the infrastructure that was non-existent. This was a commitment, along with stores, shops, and a gas station. And
Hey,
plan.
it's all here now, pretty much.
Right. I guess in a sense we could say these people had foresight. But they were talking about doing this then, and plans for completion were within 3 years. Now remember, this was 1926. All of this conversation was going on, and I love this one. That from this was also some information Esperanza sent to me. It was from the Sunrise Homeland edition of 1928. I gotta tell you, this was one of the things I found really funny about this, Esperanza. Issued under the auspices of the Long Island Chamber of Commerce, who were based at 1 West 34th Street in New York City. That's where the Long Island Chamber of Commerce was, West 34th Street. But one of the sentences when and this is again, they're describing a lot of Midhamptons. Throughout its pages, it has been the endeavor to make it authentic in every respect in order that the investor, builder, and home seeker may have at his fingertips a true and unvarnished description of the entire island layout.
Yeah. I mean, and this brochure, which, by the way, it's copyrighted by the Long Island Railroad Company, so they were probably investing heavily in this, as you can imagine.
Of course.
But yeah, it's actually like you read all these descriptions, which will we'll go into the one about Wainscot, and it's really well written.
No, it really is. But the part, and we're going to get into this now. Look, we're going to state the obvious here, and this is we know if you ride through this hamlet and you even just see the signs of when it was established and everything else, this is an ancient hamlet, okay? And this is really out of this thing, whether it's natives or more fishermen or farmers is a question. I get a load of this one, but they rival the Amagansett folk in their love of the sea. Okay, I mean, I would say so.
Yeah.
And to their credit, and again, this is Sunrise Homeland, this is Long Island Chamber of Commerce, as Esperanza mentioned, some sort of connection working with the railroad on all of this information. Some of them descended from the 35 original purchasers of East Hampton Town in 1649 and still live upon the land of their forefathers. So props to them.
Yep, they did their homework.
They did their homework, only to have Midhamptons.
Right.
Now,
we appreciate you all so much. It's beautiful, ancient, bucolic little village, but we're going to run you over with our suburbia.
That's a wow. That's a wait. I gotta take a pause on this one for a second. Run me over with suburbia. That line is epic. We have to figure out a play that could be a rock. The music now from Run Me Over with Suburbia.
Maybe it's a rock band.
Well, yeah, exactly. But Run Me Over with Our Suburbia. Okay. Very good segue, Esperanza, because Midhamptons calling themselves, and I quote, the new playground of Long Island. I mean, this is what they're writing
again. This is 1920s.
Right, this could come out of the Surf Lodge playbook, Esperanza.
Exactly. History repeats itself. It's like reading Vanity Fair or New York Times or the Post, the Wall Street's playground, the Hamptons.
Exactly. This is just this is in the 1920s. This could be written. It is being written today.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be. It is being written today.
Yes.
The new playground, and they're calling it, like they're referring to this as like a new town. I mean, okay, new town. All right. That's a pause on purpose, Esperanza, because when I'm reading something like this, Newtown, yeah, it's Newtown. John Osborne, Newtown, 1668.
Right,
a,
right.
a pasture, a cattle pasture in the 1650s in Newtown. Okay,
Well, it would be now adjacent to the polo fields, I'm sure.
adjacent to the polo fields, not far, not far from the bathing casino.
Right.
But I got to now again now, and we have a plan. We're gonna get back to this, but so we're gonna leave this area. Remember, the article was 26. The Sunrise Homeland, which was the railroad / Chamber of Commerce brochure, newsletter, whatever we call it, was 1928.
Mm-hmm.
And remember, their plan was about 3 years. So we're going to just take a step back, 1928, and we're going to go to where these seeds were planted just a few years earlier by Frank Knighton, by Ralph McPhee, by all these names we mentioned, when Lyrico was part of the people that developed a place that was near and dear to my heart, the incorporated village of Russell Gardens in Great Neck. I told Esperanza before this. I mean, my wife Rachel and I raised our family in Great Neck. We lived there for 36 years. But Rachel actually moved with her family when she was 16 years old to Russell Gardens.
Mm-hmm.
So she lived within this incorporated village, and it was a beautiful village. I mean, developed by Frank Knight and by these people. But again, and which is again, now to bring the point, this is what they were looking to duplicate in a resort community, a farm, which Wainscott really a farming community, not a resort community.
Right. Well, but they were creating a summer colony of dignity and refinement.
That words that can still be used today and are used today.
It's like our current broker babble, isn't it?
It really is exactly right. That was, thank you for that little bit of, but that is exactly what they were trying to do. And so the seeds for what they wanted to be Midhamptons were developed in Great Neck. Again, very different place. This is a suburb, a bedroom community, right off Northern Boulevard, between Northern Boulevard and the Great Neck train station. I mean, super commutable location.
Right. But I mean, back in 1924, when Captain Russell sold that land to them, it was 90 acres of pasture land. I mean, these were still semi-rural areas, right?
Completely. Without
just with closer proximity to the city.
1000% correct. And again, I'm not, this podcast is not called Our Great Neck.
No, but I loved the connection. I mean, when I found this, I mean, I immediately was like, Irwin, there's a connection.
I mean, it's gold, because the things they developed, not only Russell Gardens, there is a beautiful pre-war building called the Whitewood in Great Neck, right across the street from the Great Neck Railroad Station. And I mean, this building was also built in the 1920s, really one of these like beautiful pre-war high ceilings apartments with fireplaces, all of these kind of detail. And it was very successful, still is. I mean, it's a beautiful building, very grand in its way, in the whole vibe. It's like manor, almost, like it feels like. And they developed this area in Great Neck, and Frank Russell sold them this 90 acres of pasture land. I was telling Esperanza this before. I mean, he lived right on the corner of what is basically South Middle Neck Road, the entrance to Great Neck, and Northern Boulevard. I mean, in present day, an enormously busy intersection,
yeah,
tremendously busy. But it was also after that's where his house was. And this guy had this beautiful turreted mansion on this land up until the 1950s. And I have to say this, I mean, this really doesn't have much relevance to Our Hamptons, but I'm sorry. I have to take a little poetic license because it's a Great Neck story. An enormous catering hall called Leonard's. And anyone who's been up Island will know this place. I mean, it's super garish. You look at it, the place is massive. It looks like a stadium almost, how big it is. And with an enormous front entryway, Esperanza, with these chandeliers hanging down, gilded. It was like the Gilded Age, gilded in gold.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I guess to one person's eyes, it's wow, this is so glamorous. And then, the old expression, one person's ceiling's another person's floor. One person thinks it's glamorous, and the next guy will say, "This is the tackiest place I've ever seen in my life."
Yeah.
So no right or wrong here. It's subjective, but that's what his property became. But ultimately he developed, and it was very much like a planned community. Russell Gardens, like the trees were spaced out evenly, and the housing stock was varied. Tudors, colonials, exquisite clay tennis courts. Clay. It was like the French Open playing there. Really beautiful village. But that was where the groundwork for this happened. But to move the story a little bit along, remember now, 1928, we left it. Something happened, and I guess we can say the stock market crash or whatever of 1929 probably wasn't great for the people of Lyrico, Esperanza. But
wasn't great for Carl Fisher either.
Was it? No, it wasn't.
It's amazing how that stock market crash probably deterred a lot of development that otherwise would have changed the landscape out here quite drastically at that time. Pre-zoning and pre-planning.
And Esperanza, that's a great point, because now because this podcast is called Our Hamptons, so we're not going to get into what, we're not a stock market, we're not a market for podcast, but it does get into, if we just keep it hyper local, focused right here. Esperanza brought up Carl Fisher. We could talk about Lyrico. What was going to be developed in Wainscott, and of course Carl Fisher with the Miami Beach of the North. And look, Carl Fisher, actually succeeded in some of the things he wanted to do.
Yeah.
But obviously not all of them. And again, another theme on Our Hamptons. East Hampton, Southampton, the bookends, those estate sections, were here. This is the 1920s. These houses a lot of them were there already. But again, Wainscott, Sagaponack, Watermill, Bridgehampton, this was farmland. And then you had Montauk, all the way out. But these changes, Esperanza, could you imagine?
I try to picture it, and it's, honestly, like I said earlier, they set the groundwork, because clearly Wainscott, like I said, was near the ponds, and this was all just woodland, and this is now all Wainscott. People consider this to be Wainscott, the part, the strip next to the highway, to Montauk Highway. But in fact, it's Midhamptons, really, because that's where it must have really begun then.
For sure.
Yeah. There was not this highway.
No.
This was not the way that people went to East Hampton.
No.
In fact, we've talked about this. There was a little causeway, through over the pond, right?
Over the pond. Yeah. No, absolutely right. But, and I'm so glad you brought up the Carl Fisher too. Because it really, that could also be an entire podcast, by the way, that whole, the whole Carl Fisher saga. But these things were happening actually simultaneously.
They were, exactly. That's what I found fascinating. Yeah.
And I never really put that together until you brought up the Carl Fisher connection, which wasn't a connection per se, but just, the fact that two enormous development proposals happening simultaneously, effectively, 25 miles apart, which would have dramatically changed this.
Right.
And of course, not only, if these things happen, especially in Wainscott, because Wainscott is so much more central, it would have impacted everything surrounding Wainscott. This would have been a domino effect.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, that crash was Wainscott's best friend.
It was the savior. The bubble burst. Yeah.
The bubble burst, and this really brings us back up now. And I love this part. This Esperanza found this, and this really sort of wraps it all up so perfectly. We don't really have a date on it. We're thinking this was from the 1960s, but if you recall, the original secretary from the 1920s, Ralph McPhee, this is what he calls his letter from a grandfather to his grandchildren. And, a lot of it is a little superfluous. We don't have to go into all of it, but, he starts off by writing, Midhamptons was a dream which could have only been thought up in the crazy days of the 1920s.
How true. Yeah.
And here's where he gets into how his successors with Russell Gardens, with the Whitewood, they felt that they could easily do whatever we set our minds upon doing. We were a big company, important people serving on the board. They had this, as I mentioned, Alric Mann. His father acquired title in the 1870s to much of the land on Richmond, Queens, which is Staten Island, Queens. He had all of this land. He built up 18 apartment sites. No wonder he was enthusiastic about Midhamptons. They employed a stock selling outfit. They had an office in the Equitable Building in New York. And meanwhile, Esperanza, get a load of this. They had built in Midhampton. So they actually did apparently build a few, 4 or 5 houses, and it changed the landscape of Eastern Long Island quite a little. Now, do we have any history of where these houses? We don't really know.
I've got one on the corner of my street.
You do? Okay.
I do. I'm fairly certain I have. So if you would, any are familiar with Wainscott at all, right off the highway, there are 2 roads between, let's say, Town Line and the gas station, I guess you could say, right?
Okay.
That are Eastgate and Westgate.
Yes.
Right? So Eastgate and Westgate were part of this whole development. And along Eastgate and Westgate, you will find 4 houses, which I see as being the model houses of this development.
So like in other words, I know Eastgate and Westgate. In other words, when you go down Eastgate and Westgate, you're really seeing these are relatively probably houses, I guess, built maybe in the 70s, 80s, whatever, 60s, but you can pin out the ones that really look like they were built.
Well, they all look the same. They have the same architecture.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I really have to see these houses.
I'm
going to have to do another road trip because that is so those were the houses that he was talking about. But meanwhile, now remember, he's writing this, we're guessing somewhere in the 1960s. And this is Ralph McPhee talking. I haven't seen Midhampton since 1931 and haven't the slightest idea of what it is today. And he gets into how the acquisition of the land took many months, gaining title on some of these properties and how they employed these now famous architects named Mann and McNeil, who did a lot of the work in Russell Gardens to just, draw up these Midhampton special houses. And Esperanza, get a load of this, the elaborate development plan showing a mall and a 1.5 cross country, I think he means county here, but we're going to cross county highway, which I remember naming White Horse Turnpike. and he writes including a polo field, and I love this expression, other highfalutin extravagances.
It's about the amenities.
It wasn't this guy was giving amenities all this time ago. You're exactly right.
They were.
And he gives up, he's giving the description. But now here was a part that you really liked. I remember you were telling me about this, how he met up really with one of the gardeners, Winthrop Gardner.
Oh, yes. This
right.
Was, yes.
And
this anecdote was good.
Yeah. And like he met Winthrop, and, we don't have to get into the whole Gardener's Island thing, but, but he starts talking about it. I mean, he goes off of all of these deep tangents, how Winthrop didn't go to a dentist. I mean, all of this guy goes off the deep end a little bit, but he said he and his wife lived in a modest old Long Island home near Home Sweet Home. His wife always poring over astrology tables. And when they started, apparently, Midhamptons, they went to Winthrop for his blessing.
Yeah, well, and probably scaring up some cash, And
which I think he actually he bought $5,000 worth of their stock, which he paid them $2,500 for. Always a negotiator,
right.
Apparently, but that's where that's what he. That
was the funny anecdote, because he went to get this, to talk with him, get his blessing, and maybe get some cash probably. And the guy was like, oh, well, the bank is closed, this and that. And then he said, oh, wait a minute. And he went through the rubbish bin and pulled out an envelope and said, wait, let me just check here, and opened it up, and out pops a $2,500.
That's exactly
cash,
right.
And he just endorsed it and gave it to him, right? Something like that. So that's what I thought. And this guy, and so McPhee was like, can you imagine the carelessness? Like, you would just
That's exactly right. And he said he would deposit the dividend check that same day in the Southampton bank so that if McPhee deposited it in Great Neck, there'd be plenty of time for it to be covered.
To clear. Yeah.
This was really
whole operation.
Amazing. And the gardeners in the 1920s were still the gardeners. This was sort of probably chump change to the gardeners even back then. But
clearly it was in the rubbish bin.
That like it was nothing. Like the people that throw out lottery tickets, right? But he goes in and again, a very interesting outcome of the Midhamptons showing the craziness of the 20s was the following. They interviewed a group who were interested in selling our stock. Their names have long vanished and made a tentative deal with others. There was an investigation. They canceled the deal. And he's writing this. It seems almost funny that anyone would think he could prove that he was caused to lose $1 million in 28 by having a stock selling contract taken away from him. But that apparently is what this guy did. And it's an indication of how this operation was looked upon. And I love this, Esperanza. The courts were crowded. The Depression came along. Midhamptons proved to be a bust, so the lawsuit never came up. Mm. And I think this is really a good place to close, because this is sort of what we were referring to when we really started this episode, Esperanza. And this is Ralph McPhee. It's a pity, and this has been our experience researching this. It's a pity that so many papers referring to Midhamptons have been lost over the years. Otherwise, I would be able to prove from a subpoena that I was sued for $1 million. Gosh, was that guy optimistic?
Well, and I think I even found something while I was researching, but I'm not even sure, because honestly, you're right. It was very difficult to find anything. But one thing that, we needed to bring up was, we talked about the train station and they wanted to move it. But, the fact that they even wanted to change the name of Wainscott was of a big issue with everyone here, and very much covered in the local newspapers, the Star, the Patchogue Advance, all sorts of papers that don't exist anymore as well. But, it's interesting because how many people know, for instance, that Hampton Bays was once called
Good Ground.
Good Ground,
That's right?
So in one piece that we found, it says, more voice to them. May they outveil the ballyhoo of the boomer and the squeak of the codfish highbrow, who for sordid reasons of quality want to gild over the rugged Long Island names.
Right.
I love this. Enough harm has been done up that way by throwing away the fine old title Good Ground for such a characterless appellation as Hampton Bays.
Right.
So there were all these people up in arms about changing the name, and it didn't happen. But as I've told you, Irwin, my survey, our survey for our house, it's in the Midhampton subdivision. So that stuck.
That's amazing. And Esperanza said beforehand, there was a little, the sign of the Midhamptons. It was at a commercial district, right? It was called
right at the corner there of Wainscott Northwest Road. It had Midhampton Square.
Yeah, and again, it's amazing how this episode really completely goes full circle. And the example of Hampton Bays, Good Ground, is another one, and obviously this one. Everyone, even from the 20s. Hamptonization, the cachet they want. And we've even, Esperanza, we've even seen this up island. I mean, I've seen, driving out here, and they've called subdivisions like in the town of Brookhaven, Brookhampton. Anything to
get
you're
that
kidding. Little,
really?
Oh yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. Anything to get that, gateway to the Hamptons. Anything to
cachet.
That cachet is just, I mean, and to your point, Good Ground, really, what a name. Good Ground, New York. That's a town.
That's a solid name.
That's solid. Wainscott. That's the real deal. But Midhamptons.
I know. Well, but like you've said, the bookends: East Hampton, Southampton, Midhamptons,
right? Yeah,
Hampton Bays. You had to have the Hampton in there.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. And and it's
Our Hamptons.
We're no better, but we had
we stooped.
We did. We did have our reasons for this. I mean, because we needed people, because people, fortunately or unfortunately, but the fact is they're not going to search for something called Our Eastern Long Island. I mean, that is just the
doesn't have a
reality.
ring.
It's just not going to have a ring. And when people search, we had to. So we did that. So yes, we are calling the kettle a little bit black, but hey, well, that's okay.
Well, if you can't beat them, join them, right?
Exactly. Esperanza, that was really, man,
another good one, Irwin.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you for bringing this one up and bringing it to our attention. Wow, Midhamptons.
Oh, I'm happy if more information comes up. I feel like this is something that I want to continue exploring for sure, because it
resonates with you certainly, and
of course,
even into what the work you do with Wainscot Heritage Project.
Exactly,
I mean, there's completely a connection. But this was
but just about the vision of having, of how a community develops, right?
Yes,
and to think how different it could have been.
It completely. Wow, this was it's really, really, while it's fun, it was entertaining. It really is food for thought also.
Exactly.
Just what might have happened here if circumstances
and kind of elusive to what has happened in a way, right?
In a sense, you could almost say part of Lyrico's vision did come true.
Yes,
just not circa 1926.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks, Esperanza.
Thank you, Irwin. Until next time.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.